Boy notices smell coming from Grandpa's bedroom, checked it and calls 911. Tina sat motionless before her laptop. For the last few weeks, her son had been refusing to go to his grandfather's house and she had no idea why. That day, when she dropped him off at the old man's place, she could see the distress on his face. Something wasn't right, she could feel it in her bones. She was lost in her thoughts when the phone rang. Tina had no idea what tragedy would follow seconds later. The change in Tim started suddenly. Over the years, he'd always adored his grandfather and looked forward to visiting the old man. But over the last few weeks, something had changed. Tim was refusing to spend time alone at his grandfather's place, but when his mother asked him about it, he'd shut himself off to her. Tina had never been the type of mother to force her child to do something he didn't want to, but she wasn't handling the change very well. She'd always adored the relationship between her father and her son. But over the course of a few weeks, her son seemed to change. Every time he returned from the old man's house, he seemed dazed and confused. Tina didn't know it then, but something sinister had occurred behind her back. That day, Tina simply wanted her son to give it another shot. "Please, you haven't visited Grandpa in over a month. He's been asking about you. Can't you just do this for me?" she begged the preteen. She could see the worry behind her young son's eyes. He avoided eye contact, his eyes focused firmly on the floor. Tina knew that something wasn't right, but Tim didn't want to talk about it. She decided to push. "Why didn't you want to go to his house anymore? Is there something I should know about?" she asked. He rolled his eyes, irritated his mother was bugging him about it. "I just feel ill every time I go and his house smells weird lately," he mumbled to himself. But Tina wanted an explanation. She pressed him again and again, asking, "What do you mean, feel ill how?" She frowned sadly, concerned about her son. He didn't want to have to deal with this right now. "Look, if I agree to go today, will you stop asking me about it?" he asked, his voice tense with annoyance. Tina made the mistake of agreeing to this. Tim sat quietly in the passenger seat of his mother's car, his palms sweaty and his heart racing. He feared what might happen this time. Tina sat beside her son, aware of the tension in the air. The drive seemed to last a lifetime, but they soon pulled up to the old man's driveway. That day was about to take a tragic turn. If only Tina had never insisted he visit the old man. Tina Mayfair was a loving and devoted single mother to her only son, Tim. Living in Seattle, Washington, life hadn't been easy for the pair. Tina worked long hours every day trying to give her son the future he deserved. Although they were always strapped for cash, they had one person who would help them no matter what. George, Tina's father, would stop at nothing to protect his family. He knew how much his daughter struggled and he did everything he could to help her. But Tim was the apple of George's eyes, and over the years the two of them had grown rather close. George was the closest thing Tim had to a father, and he'd always sworn to protect the boy. But one day something terrible would happen. Since Tim was a little boy, he'd spend every weekend at his grandfather's house. It allowed his mother to relax while he got to spend time with a male parental figure. Over the years, Tim had grown extremely attached to his grandfather, and he refused to spend a single weekend away from the old man. But that all changed suddenly one summer. Tina could still remember how it all started. It was the last weekend in June, and when Tim returned from George's house that Sunday evening, she could tell something was up. He was disoriented and exhausted, complaining of nausea and drowsiness. Tina assumed he was getting sick, but she didn't think much of it. 2 days later, Tim seemed to be back to normal. "It's just weird, I've never felt that way before," he told his mother that morning. But neither of them thought it was a big deal. But that following weekend, when the boy returned from his grandfather's house again, the same thing happened. Tim was sick as a dog. In the weeks that followed, something about the boy changed. The following weekend, when Tina offered to drop her son at George's house, she was taken aback by his response. "I'm not going this weekend," he told his mother casually as he sat down in front of the television. When Tina asked her son why he wouldn't visit his grandfather, he said nothing. His eyebrows were tucked together and Tina could tell something was bothering him. She decided to leave it be. She assumed her son just wanted a weekend at home. Perhaps he was just in a bad mood. That weekend, she happily spent her time hanging out with her young son. They went out to the movies and even went down to the beach. Tim seemed fine from the outside but was fighting an internal battle. The same thing happened the following weekend and then every weekend after that. Tim refused to visit his grandfather and Tina had no idea why. She tried to speak to her son about it, but he'd leave the room every time she did. Tim had always shared everything with Tina, but now he was refusing to talk about the matter. She was starting to wonder if something had happened between Tim and George, but one day she finally learned the truth. George had been asking Tina about the boy, but she didn't know what to tell him. And that day she simply wanted her son to visit his grandfather, but she was putting him in a dangerous situation. He rolled his eyes, irritated his mother wouldn't leave it be. "I just feel weird every time I go and his house smells weird." Tina was pressing her son for answers. She was tired of getting ignored every time she asked him why he didn't want to visit George. She was worried and didn't know if something was happening behind closed doors. Tim wouldn't admit it aloud, but he was scared as he sat in the passenger seat. Tina sat beside him, aware of the tension in the air. As soon as Tim stepped out of the car, Tina drove off, unaware of what was about to happen. But as Tina made her way home, she couldn't help the uneasy feeling that bubbled in her stomach. Tim took a deep breath before stepping into his grandfather's home. As soon as he stepped inside, he could smell that same strange scent from before. He knew something wasn't right. What was going on in his grandfather's house? As Tim cautiously made his way through the house, he noticed an unusual stillness in the air. The smell that had lingered for weeks seemed to grow stronger, sending shivers down his spine. His unease deepened as he approached his grandfather's study, a room he'd visited countless times before. It was like the smell was even stronger as he ventured deeper into the house. His movements caused the deserted hallway to reverberate with every footfall. Despite being a frequent visitor, this visit felt different. Grandpa George was nowhere in sight, and this time Tim had to let himself in. As he traversed the winding passageways of the house, he could sense an odd odor permeating through the air. It was overpowering and repulsive, like a noxious mixture of decaying flesh and harsh chemicals. He wrinkled his nose in disgust, trying to identify the source of the stench, which seemed to be emanating from a specific area of the house, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly where. Tim inched hesitantly forward into the dimly lit interior of his grandfather's home, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. As he cautiously made his way through the winding passageways of the house, Tim's senses were assailed by a peculiar scent that hung thick and heavy in the air. The odor was sharp and acrid. He scrunched up his nose in disgust, trying to locate the source of the stench. It seemed to be emanating from a specific area of the house, but despite his best efforts, he couldn't seem to pinpoint the exact spot. Silence filled the old house as Tim tiptoed up the stairs, trying his best not to make any noise. However, the ancient wooden steps beneath his feet creaked with every step he took, filling the still air with an eerie sound. As he reached the top floor, the stench of something rotting invaded his nose, causing him to cover it with his hand in an attempt to block out the foul odor. Despite the nauseating smell, Tim searched every room on the top floor, carefully opening each door and peering inside, hoping to find his grandfather. However, his search was in vain as his grandfather was nowhere to be found. As Tim walked down the hallway, he could smell something strange. It grew stronger as he approached the last room at the end of the corridor. Tim had never gone upstairs much when he visited his grandfather. Generally, he stayed downstairs in the living room when he spent time with George, but today he was going where he wasn't supposed to. Even when he was briefly upstairs, his grandfather told him never to go into the last room, but the door wasn't closed this time. When he peered through the slightly open door, he was hit by the overpowering stench. Despite his hesitation, Tim gathered his courage and pushed the door open, revealing the source of the smell. The room was dark and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust. When they did, he saw a table in the middle of the room. On the table was a large open jar filled with a strange thick liquid. Tim recoiled in disgust as he got closer. The liquid inside was a murky greenish-brown color and seemed to be bubbling slightly. He couldn't identify the contents of the jar, but he knew it was something he'd never seen before. Tim couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He wasn't qualified to know what was inside. The boy felt sick just looking at the swirling concoction. He looked to the right and saw a shelf with a dozen more of the jars. He had no idea what they were. Maybe his grandfather would have some answers, but where was he? He decided it was best to leave the jar alone after he identified the smell wasn't coming from it. Tim decided to leave this strange and mysterious room alone now. He was bent on finding the smell that had been causing him to be sick every time he went to his grandpa's house. He felt like no one would listen to him. His grandfather seemed oblivious to it, and his mother pressured him to go there. He wanted to make sure he wasn't crazy, but the boy had no idea what he was about to uncover. Just as Tim made his way to the door back into the hallway, he noticed something odd. Just to the left of the door, there was an old cupboard. Tim knew he wouldn't get the opportunity to get into the room again and had to take his chance. He walked towards the cupboard and slowly opened its doors, but on the shelves he saw strange ingredients. It started to click inside his head as he realized what they were there for. It was a bag of yeast, among other things. He looked back at the bubbling jars and finally made the connection. It was a room for brewing yeast into dough. He'd heard of people doing it before, but he had no idea his grandfather was one of them. But one question still lingered on his mind: where the smell was coming from, and where was George? He turned around and headed back downstairs. He was sure he'd find his grandfather in the living room, but he didn't know that he'd be distracted by something on his way. It would be the smell again. He'd get sidetracked again, but it was to George's detriment. Tim had spent nearly 20 minutes investigating the smell in the house, but he had no idea that while he was stalling, his grandfather was in danger. He needed him desperately and he wasn't around. There was one final place he'd check before finding his grandfather, but would he make it in time? He couldn't put his finger on it, but it somehow smelled like rotten eggs. However, he knew his grandfather hadn't made any. He peered into the kitchen and there was no evidence he'd made eggs. Besides, his grandfather loved cereal for breakfast just like Tim did, specifically Cheerios. He could see the box on the kitchen counter. He was confused. Why would the house smell like eggs and no eggs were made in the house? It was a weird situation. He wondered if there was maybe a dead animal somewhere in the house. He knew his grandfather had put out mouse traps. But then Tim remembered they were catch and release traps, not intended for the animal to die. Tim wandered through the house. It was very quiet and he guessed that his grandfather was outside in the garden tending to his plants. But when he looked through the kitchen window and didn't see him there, he became slightly worried. His grandfather knew he was coming over. He was excited when he spoke to him over the phone a few days prior. He'd made plans for them to grill some hot dogs. He planned for them to watch the game together. But maybe he stepped out to the store to get something, Tim thought. But that was when he heard the sound, a faint knocking coming from his grandfather's bedroom. Tim quickly made his way to the bedroom, and when he opened the door, he couldn't believe what he was looking at. "Grandpa?" he called as he walked through the house towards the bedroom. He was confused. Usually George would be waiting by the door to welcome him in. He slowly walked through the house calling for his grandfather, but he was getting no response. He held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he opened the bedroom door, he finally found George, and his heart dropped. George was on the couch in a puddle of sweat. Tim's heart skipped a beat. His grandfather wasn't looking well at all. "Grandpa?" he asked with a shaky voice, but barely got a response. George was gasping for breath on the couch. He could barely speak. He was too weak. Suddenly, Tim was reminded of how ill he felt just weeks before. Tim didn't know what to do as he walked toward his grandfather. The old man was in and out of consciousness, and Tim knew he had to do something about it. He did the first thing that came to mind. Tim wasted no time as he dialed the 3-digit number, hoping help would arrive before it was too late. 911, what's your emergency? Tim told the operator all about his grandfather and his symptoms, and by the end of it, she asked him to step outside. Do you think you can take him with you? The operator asked. No, he can't stand up. I'm not strong enough to take him outside by myself, Tim admitted, tears welling up behind his eyes. Okay, honey, just wait outside for me, all right? Help's on the way. But back home, Tina was having a tough time too. Tina couldn't stop thinking about her son on her way home. She couldn't help but wonder what was going on. Did something happen between Tim and his grandfather? Was there a reason why her son had been feeling ill each time he came home? She was starting to get worried. As soon as Tina got home, she decided to do something she never thought she'd do. In her anxiety, Tina decided to call her neighbor Mrs. Jenkins, who'd lived next door to George for years. She thought Mrs. Jenkins might have some insight into what was happening. As the phone rang, Tina's mind raced with worry. Mrs. Jenkins answered, and Tina poured out her concerns about Tim and the strange occurrences at George's house. Mrs. Jenkins hesitated before finally revealing something that sent a chill down Tina's spine. Mrs. Jenkins confessed that she'd noticed some weird smells coming from George's house, but never thought it was her place to interfere. She spoke of late-night disturbances where she once saw George looking for something in the garden. He had a mask over his nose to mask the smell. She guessed that he was looking for a dead animal because that's what it smelled like to her. Tina was now more determined than ever to get to the bottom of things. She felt a mix of fear and determination, her heart pounding in her chest. Tim had complained of the smell for so long that all she thought was her father probably hadn't put the garbage out or something. But now Mrs. Jenkins noticed it too? What was going on, Tina wondered. She hoped that the father wasn't busy with his collection of roadkill again. She knew that he used to collect roadkill and turn it into taxidermy. His whole house was filled with it. However, she was sure that Tim would have noticed the dead animals if that was the case. It was one of her father's hobbies that he'd given up on, or so she thought. There was one way she could check if he was doing it again because she warned him the dead animals could make him ill. Was he deliberately defying her orders? Once she got home, she knew exactly what to do. She'd completely forgotten that she could do this without her father knowing about it. She sat in front of her laptop and started it up. Years earlier, she'd installed security cameras in George's home. She didn't want to spy on them, but she wanted to ensure that everything was all right back at George's. After a few clicks on the mouse, she was able to open the footage on her laptop, but she couldn't believe her eyes. She switched from camera to camera, but she couldn't spot her son or her father anywhere in the house. She was motionless in her seat, wondering what on earth was going on. Where was her son? She tried to call him, but there was no answer. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones. She was lost in her thoughts when her phone started ringing, but she had no idea what tragedy would follow seconds later. With shaky hands, she answered the phone, fearing the worst. Hello? She spoke quietly, her blood running cold. Hello, is this Tina Mayfair? An unknown person spoke on the other end of the line. Tina was preparing herself for the worst as she spoke in a shaky voice. Yes, this is she. That was when they told her the heartbreaking news. Ma'am, my name's Officer John Adams. We got a call from your son about an hour ago. It seems there was a carbon monoxide leak in your father's home. The man shared the bone-chilling news. Tina was at a loss for words. How could something like this happen? How long had this been going on for? Was that why Tim always felt sick when he returned from his grandpa's? Are my son and father okay? She cried. Yes, ma'am. We have your father in the hospital. He suffered severe carbon monoxide poisoning, but he will be all right. He and your son are at the hospital. We have professionals in his home. They're fixing the issue. Tears poured down Tina's face. She was relieved by the news, but at the same time she was terrified. She wasted no time before heading to the hospital. When Tina arrived at the hospital, she was relieved to find Tim and George in his hospital room. While George was fast asleep, Tim was there to greet his mother with a loving hug. I thought he was gonna die, Tim told his mother. "But he didn't, you saved him," his mother cried, holding him tightly against her. Tim was relieved. He could finally go back to his grandfather's house without feeling ill. Both of them looked exhausted, but there was a mix of relief and worry in their eyes. Tim stood up and embraced his mother, their tears mingling in a moment of overwhelming emotion. George weakly lifted his hand to reassure Tina. "We're gonna be okay," he whispered, his voice strained but filled with gratitude. Tina, torn between anger and concern, couldn't help but demand an explanation. In the hushed hospital room, George hesitated before revealing the unsettling truth. He'd completely forgotten to call someone to fix the problem, and in the end, the fumes left him confused and delirious. The guilt etched on George's face mirrored Tina's shock. Tim, still recovering from the ordeal, interjected, "I told Grandpa about the weird smell, but he said not to worry. I didn't know it was making us sick." The revelation hung heavy in the air, creating a tense silence in the hospital room. Tina struggled to process the information. Her father's forgetfulness had put both her and her son's life at risk. The realization of how close they'd come to tragedy made her shudder. Tim, sensing his mother's turmoil, said, "I didn't want to go back because I felt sick every time. I thought it was just me, but I didn't want to risk it anymore." The vulnerability in his voice tugged at Tina's heart. In the days that followed, the family faced the aftermath of the incident. The house was declared unsafe until proper ventilation and cleanup took place. George, remorseful and apologetic, vowed to ensure the safety of his family. As they navigated through the process of rebuilding trust, Tina, Tim, and George attended therapy sessions together. The experience, though harrowing, became a catalyst for open communication with the family. With time, the scars of the carbon monoxide incident began to heal. The house was renovated and safety measures were put in place. George learned a valuable lesson. However, Tina gave him the benefit of the doubt because of his age. He was prone to forgetfulness. The trio emerged from the ordeal stronger, their bond deepened by the shared trauma. Weekends at Grandpa's house took on a new meaning, a symbol of resilience, forgiveness, and the strength of family.